Okay, hello everybody. We are right at the 2:30 mark, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. For those of you who just signed in, we'd love to hear who you are and where you're from down in the chat box over there. You can see people signing in. So welcome to our webinar today. We have Carol West here, and he has introduced himself over in the chat box on the side there, so I will let you check that out. Some other announcements about the Regional Heritage Stewardship Program. As you guys hopefully know, we do have our last set of upcoming workshops be happening in June, one in Guntersville, Alabama, and one in Pensacola, Florida. There's more information about those on our website, or you can let me know in the comments and I can send you um, more information. So I don't want to take too much time, so I'm going to pass it over to our guest of the day, Dr. West. Dr. West, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Samantha. They Samantha knows I can tend to be long-winded, so I'll try to stay on point today. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Good Friday. I know here in Tennessee the weather is the sun has come out and it looks like it's going to be a glorious Easter weekend, so we're all looking forward to that. And I certainly appreciate everyone joining this discussion today. Now, what I'm going to do is first talk about some sort of general patterns in Deep South Southern architecture. And then from the general patterns, we'll move into specific treatments for particular building types. So please use the chat box if you have questions, and I'll try to pick up on those as I move along. But we will have time left at the end for you to ask any questions that you might have. So, with no more to be said as far as an introduction, let's get started. When you think about Southern building traditions, and this is a point I like to make to wherever I am in the South, there is no one South. There are many Souths. We have different regions. Some of you are coming from Alabama, I notice. We have someone from Florida. We have people from different states. And as you well know, take Florida, for example, the panhandle in the northern part of the state is so different than the southern part of Florida, but everyone thinks everything's the same. The same with Alabama, where the Tennessee Valley region is totally different from the Birmingham region, which is then in turn totally different from the Black Belt. And then you move into the coastal area of Mobile, yet another subregion within the Greater South. So everything I say is sort of tempered by that reality that trends, you can see general trends, but within different regions, they will have their own sort of patterns and architectural traditions that always are worthy of respect and further explanation. I started off intentionally with the Great Greek Revival house from the Alabama Black Belt because that's what everyone thinks it's all about. But as we'll get into, it's a little bit deeper than that. But these are the traditions I see that binds us together. Yeah, certainly the South is different than other parts of the country in its climate, in its geography. And that shapes our architecture, no doubt, as we'll see, particularly in the raised cottage tradition of the Deep South. But so much of what we see was not designed purposely by architects. What we see instead is a very strong visual and oral tradition in Southern building that still continues today. Contractors do the great bulk of work. Some might work from plans, but some just work from their own mind's eye of what makes a good building and what solves a particular problem. And I'm influenced by that tradition as we get into building treatments. You will see I do a lot of that. What makes sense, what is common sense, maybe sometimes better than just text bookish. Um, we'll certainly talk a lot about the interplay of culture and function. Um, Southern culture is greatly diverse. Everyone thinks it's just a African American white division. It's much more diverse than that, and always has been. And then how that plays in with what buildings are used for. Agriculture in the South is not the same in every different region. Even in the Deep South, where everyone wants to say, oh, you mean the Cotton South? Well, that's part of the Deep South. People don't realize how much livestock was always important in the Deep South, nor do they have any clue, it seems like, how important timber is. And all of those types of agricultural products drive the types of farms, drive the types of outbuildings, drive the types of trade villages that you encounter. Now, I do think two things that here at the end we can see as real commonalities across the South. The use and availability of local materials. I just think that characterizes the vernacular architectural traditions. You see log and brick and stone and all different types of materials, and it sort of depends on the availability of those in a particular area. Certainly, you don't see log along the coast as much as you do, say, in northern Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But a lot of people think that there is nothing there to be seen of log traditions at all. That must be Appalachian. So again, the South is diverse and the architecture shows that. And throughout our entire storyline, you certainly have that diversity being played out in different architectural ideas, different styles, and what makes a good building. People brought with them what they had experienced elsewhere in the built environment, and then shaped truly a regional tradition here in the South. So I always like to begin with the log traditions because in some ways people think they're totally Appalachian, but actually they can be found throughout the region, and they were used quite late into the 20th century. For example, Muddy Waters House from Mississippi. This is out in the Delta. It's, as you can see, sort of within a grove of trees, and in fact, those trees still exist today. But the log cabin was taken down in the 1990s because, well, it's sort of far gone and it's going to fall apart, so let's take it apart and move it somewhere. And actually, as we'll get into this is the type of building that can be preserved in site and can find a new use. So, log traditions are in this region and they are important. Another example, outside of the single pen cabin, that becomes a building block for larger buildings over time. And here's a good example of that from the Wheeler Plantation in Alabama, where you can see the form that is called a Dogtrot here in the image on the left. You have two single pen cabins, each with their own exterior end chimney that you can see over here in the detail on the right. And then they're just connected by a sort of gable roof. Well, in fact, the logs didn't even match up in the Wheeler Plantation. You can see that there's two different roof lines there, and what is created is a central passage, a third room that could be used because in southern climates, having a sort of outside covered workspace makes sense to be comfortable in the heat. It also makes sense to be in out of the rain. So you could expand your family with that building block of the single pen cabin, add a second one nearby, and then just sort of cover the two with a common gable roof. So this is a very important building in Alabama that's part of the Joseph Wheeler State Park, and it doesn't get as much attention as the Confederate General's house that stands nearby, but it shows you the adaptability of this form too. Because after the Wheeler family built the nicer home, well, this became then quarters for their enslaved labor there on the plantation. And that helped to keep it in use and keep it preserved to when it became a state park. Now, one other thing about this type of building I want to note is where it's on a stone pier foundation. Now, that's how a lot of log buildings were placed. They weren't placed on continuous foundations, but on stone piers. And they look rickety, but they're not. They have those things will often hold for many years, and that becomes important in the later sort of preservation of this building. If it had been placed directly on the ground, the bottom logs would have rotted. The whole structure probably would have collapsed. So by raising it up so it could have ventilation and not trap moisture, it helped to save the building long term. Okay, so if you take the single pin as starting your building blocks of Southern architecture, well, then you can move into the larger forms. The single pin house could be moved into the Dogtrot, and then it could be moved into a two-story house. Now, some scholars like to call these the I house. And that's a fair enough phrase because you have the two chimneys at either end, and it's sort of like an eye that's laying down on the ground. I get the idea. But really, just think of it as a center hall house. And the Redding House in Georgia is a great example of this because you can see vaguely here, and I apologize for the image, but there on the top image at the bottom is the open Dogtrot. They never actually filled that in. And you can see over here in the bottom image the original logs. So when they added the second floor, they just clapboarded the whole thing. And then that sort of covered it up and made it look like, oh yeah, this is a typical sort of middle class plantation house of that time. And the Reddings did own slaves. They were successful planters in this valley. That's one reason the house survives. They did modernize it somewhat in the 20th century, and you see this quite often too, by adding an L addition. And by the L, we mean that you just add another building to sort of one end of the building, creating an L-like shape to the entire house. So you can see it here, and it's built out of yet another building material that you often find in the South. Board and batten construction, or what some call box construction, where actually those vertical boards are just nailed right into the base, and then you cover the space in between with a thinner bit of lumber called the batten. So that's why it's called boards and batten. And of course, this comes out of the machine age to be able to cut this lumber and to cut the battens. These come later. Well, in this case, this is how they added a room to the back of the house that then they sent electricity through, and this was the first kitchen of that house. Now, the overall form, as I say there in the notes, mimics the central hall house that you find out of the UK, particularly in Ireland. And that's not surprising either, since that was an early dominant group of settlers in the South. Now, the Redding House, I think, prepares you well from this house from the Alabama Black Belt. And I think everyone who's worked in this area has seen many, many of these that survive today. And here's the center hall house with the two-story Greek Revival portico, where you got square posts on two different levels supporting the classical pediment. This is how you could take that building block house of just squarish rooms around a central hallway that you can see here in the middle and have a quite stylish home. And middle class Southerners built these by the thousands throughout the region. And a lot of people once felt this was just an Upper South phenomenon, but as many of you who are involved in this phone call know, you can find these throughout the South, even down into the coastal regions. Now, one other thing I want to pull out about this image here is the 5 bays or 5 openings to the house. When we describe these, we often call it a two-story central hall house with 5 bays, and that would be the central bay being flanked by 2 bays of equal size. And when I see this on the outside, I know what the floor plan is on the inside. It will have 2 rooms on either side of those hallways of roughly equal size. And again, this is just a popular Southern format into the turn of the 20th century. And they can be hidden sometimes behind some of the more grandiose examples of Southern architecture. Demopolis, Alabama is a great place to pull off the interstate and go explore in. This is one of their historic homes, the Bluffs. Again, from just about the time, the decade before or so of the American Civil War. And it looks like, oh, yes, there's a grand Greek revival house there. I know what that is. But then when you actually turn around and get to the front of it, you see that same 5 bay central hall plan that we just saw in the earlier home. What really distinguishes this place is the grand portico. And much like the very opening slide I showed you, it's almost like a wraparound effect. The columns dominate the house. And that is something you see more in the Deep South than you see in other parts of the region. Okay, another facet that you see in the Deep South more than other parts are the cottages. I've gotten sort of really interested in the cottages of the Deep South in the last 10 years, and I want to explore more into them. This is a good example from Biloxi, Mississippi, that it has 2 front doors. In other words, it's a double cell building. There's 2 rooms inside of this, and you have the 2 front doors accessing it. But whereas in my region of the South, you would expect that chimney to be in the middle where it's affecting, serving both rooms. Heat isn't such an issue here. So you have the chimney on one end of the house, and it is heating one room well, and maybe the other room is not heated so well. This is a very interesting building from the early 19th century there in Biloxi. And as I said, I want to find out more about this type. But I'll show you some, instead of rambling on about that, let me show you a version that you probably have seen. This is from New Orleans, and you can find these in a lot of the coastal areas, the raised cottage. And of course, everyone always says, oh, yeah, that's because of the flooding. They have the cottage on a full basement, and the house sits on a full basement, that in this case you can enter. Well, that was certainly part of their thinking, but not really the whole story. The raised cottage was raised up so high, so then you really had adequate ventilation blowing under the building, helping to keep it cool and dry. And it's a comfort level. Now, homes often would fill these in over time, and you have a raised cottage that looks much like this house in New Orleans from the 1830s. But sometimes it's not, it's just raised on a tall foundation. So you can find that as well as you work through the architecture of the region. This is somewhat an example of that. Now, this is a house in Carrollton, Alabama, that we just had an opportunity to research last year, and it's just fascinating. As I said, it's a cottage of cottages because the 2 wings here on either side are really just small cottage additions. They're 1 room, fully realized space. It would be a, a great home for many, many people at that time. And what the family did was to move these 2 buildings onto this plot of land outside of the town square, just a couple of blocks away. And then in the middle, they inserted a full cottage. Foundation is not raised fully at all. I mean, it's a brick foundation, continuous. It's not the full raised cottage effect, but it does really show you a sprawling type house, which divided up space that you could have separate spaces in the wings, and then you had a huge family space here. And one other thing that we found so interesting with this property is the different roof lines. A gable roof on the two cottage wings, but then the central cottage has a huge hip roof. So this was a house that, as we researched it for the family, it's got 1840 roots, but then it gets its last changes into the 1920s and 30s. And when you're out working on conservation projects, this type of domestic environment is not surprising to encounter. Now, maybe you don't get the ghost on the bicycle in the front yard. You can now tell what time of the year we were out here visiting. But you do get these houses that have grown, changed, and evolved in different ways over time. And that reflects so much of the history of the house that you want to get into to actually know what to do in any restoration project. Okay, and that the cottages are a good introduction to transition us into Victorian forms, post Civil War forms in the South. The gable front and wing house, you find these throughout the region. Easy adaptations of central hall houses, as were the two-story versions of them. Sometimes some books will call these the upright and wing. I prefer just to call them a two-story gable front and wing house because it's easy to see where the gable front comes in. It's an addition that instead of being on the rear is on the front of the house, and the gable end of the addition faces, the street or the road. And the one here in the bottom is a good example of how they took a central hall house, 3 bays, added a wing to stretch it out, gave them more space, gave them a way to sort of decorate it with Victorian detailing, and suddenly you took an older house and updated it, made it larger, but also made it more in style with the post-Civil War look of so much that was being built. So the gable front form is something that, again, is not just a Mid-South, it's a Deep South, it's an Appalachian South, it can be even the coastal South that you see this form. But one thing I do like about the Deep South, they did embrace Gothic style more so than my region of the South when you think of the Upper South. Now, we could all pull out 50 different exceptions to that general rule. And certainly we have some really wonderful Gothic revival buildings in North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But in small towns, I'm always impressed by the quality of the Gothic revival, as this house from Demopolis, where you got the prominent steep gables, then the Victorian tracery there around defining the gable even further, and even church-like wings being, windows being inserted into those gables. It is still a center hall plan. You can see the central entrance there with the side lights and all, but that has been sort of expanded out with the bay windows. Now, these types of houses can be evolutionary houses too, that they began as a center hall house and then sort of added a new front to it. But sometimes they're purpose built this way to begin with. I just always like to warn people, know the history of the building maybe before you even start physical investigation, because what you see here on the front might be how it was originally, or this just might be a one-story central hall house that then got updated in the 1860s or 1870s. Okay, shotgun houses. when most people talk about Deep South architecture, they think of two things. They think of the great classical mansions, and then they think of shotguns. And shotguns are stronger in numbers in the Deep South than they are throughout the rest of the country. But I've also found shotgun houses throughout the South. It's sort of a ubiquitous building form for white and black. And they're typically frame, although I have seen some brick shotguns. Usually the brick shotguns are built as industrial housing into the 20th century. They're not just from the 19th century, but even a lot of frame houses are built as shotguns in the 20th century. And that's like why I like to use the one up here in the right corner. That's from Tupelo, Mississippi, and that is Elvis's birthplace, built by his father and grandfather. So they knew what a shotgun was like. It has a central, usually an off-center entrance, and then three interconnected rooms. You go from one to the next to the next. And that's where the phrase shotgun comes from, that supposedly you could stick a shotgun through the front of the house, shoot the gun, and it would go through the house without hitting a wall because of the interconnected rooms. Now, again, that's not a great phrase to use, shotgun house, but at least it conveys the idea there was no separate hallway to these types of dwellings. New Orleans is famous for its shotguns, and you see here on the left just one that I picked out of many that I have photographed there over the years. Here is one that is actually known as get this, camelback shotgun. That's right, camelback, where you have a double shotgun. See, there's two different shotguns under a shared hip roof. Here's one door, here's the other door behind the tree. But then to give more space, they added a big two-story addition to the back. So that's where the phrase camelback shotgun comes from. And yes, this is taking advantage of space in a vibrant urban area. You can't say the same as for this little Mississippi Delta town where you have a traditional shotgun on a small town lot that just keeps on extending back over time. So you see these as well. And shotguns are fascinating to study because typically they have been adapted, they have been changed in different ways, but that basic floor plan will stay intact because it's just a nice flexible floor plan for a family to work from. Okay, so what I've been doing here at the first third is really talking about common architectural trends and common types. Now I want to switch into steps that you take when you undertake a conservation project with a house. And in this case, I want to start with a writer who taught me a lot, Harvey McKee. He wrote a very influential book on house restoration in the mid 20th century. And I've always liked McKee's concept that to understand what you're doing, you have to understand the building as a whole. As he says, it's a system in which all of the materials are interrelated. And although we get used to studying the different properties and different treatments of different materials, you have to keep in mind they were designed to all work together. And that can sometimes happen. You get caught up in how to properly treat the logs of a building, and then you don't really pay that much attention to some other aspect, and the building has problems, and you wonder why. Well, you didn't think of the whole. And I just think that general quote that I pulled out from one of his books is really important to keep in mind as we move through any type of restoration project. And you have to look beyond the walls too. This might be my little addition to Harvey. Think about where it sets. think about the landscaping around it, the plantings. Think about noise, not noise, excuse me, vibration from traffic, from railroads. We'll see that a bit later. To just the highway traffic of today. A lot of our real landmark properties that people want to preserve are along older state and federal roads. And one of the big problems they really face is the vibration of truck traffic of today. And it's just something you have to really consider when you look at preservation projects. Another trend that you'll get tired of me saying over this next hour is controlling water and the access of water to your property. That is one thing we're blessed with in the South is plentiful rainfall, but it is nothing is more dangerous to traditional building materials than water. So keeping the water out is the primary purpose of a building, and when it's not addressed appropriately, that's going to be probably in most cases the root cause of your problem. And solving that is a fundamental first step. For example, some all of these wrapped into a building that I find just fascinating. This is the Hare Conrad cabin from Tennessee. It's near the Georgia border, but I included it in this presentation because it just shows all of these problems of setting all together at once. It is associated with the Cherokee Trail of Tears. In fact, one of the detachment leaders, the groups of Cherokees as they were moved were placed into detachments. He lived in this house and he left on the Cherokee Trail of Tears from this place. So the property owners know it's important and they want to keep it preserved. It's privately owned. So we get asked, well, what do we do? And immediately the family was like, well, we know that this lean-to here on the right, well, that's a problem, isn't it? Well, yeah, because that means you're sort of covering up a wall of logs and it's not getting much sunlight and it's probably leading to some deterioration, which was true. And then they were like, well, but we have everything else sort of in good shape, don't we? It's like, well, we don't like the plantings around the base because that's retaining moisture too. Well, they didn't really like that because it's grandma's plants and I understood that, but you could also dig up grandma's plants and put them in planters and set them a bit away or maybe someplace else because that's just retaining moisture at your base. And you really have sort of the foundation has been lowered probably because of dirt accumulation. And you really got a problem with moisture underneath the building because it's not allowed to breathe. And so by this time, they were sort of like getting mad and maybe a bit depressed. And then I really made them mad by saying, but your biggest problem is all of these limbs around here. Well, we love this shaded space. Everyone thinks it's beautiful. Well, it is that, but limbs means they can fall. We do have these things called tornadoes through our region. And strong winds will knock branches out and they can crush a log building. So you really want to think about the whole setting here. Well, that didn't get a ringing endorsement, but then it started to sort of make sense to the property owners, again, of how they have to think about their property as a whole, not just the problem they had with wet logs on one side of the house. Okay, so it's important to give a good look before you get started. It's also important to discover the history of your property because, as I've hinted at in earlier slides, this becomes a good way for you to understand maybe why things happened and then when they happened. Because that can give you clues as to what was done, the treatment that they used, maybe the introduction of new materials as a family grew larger. as the building stopped being a home and became instead a commercial business. All of that type of information can really help you understand your building better. And the more facts you know, the more patterns you can be aware of, means you have fewer surprises as you start your project. And then the other part of this is it starts to let you know, well, should I really be concerned? And here I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the importance of having enough history left in your building to justify preservation. Now, the common National Register designation of this is integrity. Does the building have architectural integrity? And that seems to be an odd phrase to use, that as if a building has to worry about that. They have enough problems as it is. Why don't we think of that as, really, is there enough history there left? Is there enough original material? Have new materials, changes in location, changes in surroundings, has has that been so altered that you no longer have a sort of sense of itself, as that second bullet point emphasizes, from when the property was historic? And then you start to ask yourself, well, or what we plan to do, will that lessen the building's integrity? Will it make it worse? Does it help it take away its historical sense? You want to retain that, because if you don't, you really destroy what makes the building historic, and you just have, well, a sort of old building, but it's a hodgepodge of different things, and I can't really make a case that it speaks to the 1830s or 1870s or 1920s. So this is where we really encourage people to think about this issue strongly. And it's a message that you can't get tired of telling, because it seems like people need to hear it. Here's a property in Georgia. As you can see, it was on the Trail of Tears. This is why I think we get the phone call. Could you come down and look at this? We started to work on this old hotel, which is what you see there in the image. Three gabled front, chimneys across. And we found a log section, which you can see over here on the right. And we know Cherokees lived here first. Could this be the Cherokee dwelling? Well, sure enough, once I get down there, they had already stripped away most of the back. And you could see, well, clearly it was a two-story single pen dwelling of some size, and probably served both as a residence and a place of business, maybe a tavern. But it had been evolved over time, with wings on the front, wings on the back, to become, the sort of turn of the 20th century hotel for people passing through this part of the state. But the group was so determined to just work on the Cherokee story. They privileged the log section, that they didn't pay too much attention to what they were doing with the clapboarding or the bricks or anything else with the house. And they've ended up just restoring the logs, and they have lost everything else about the house. And while doing this, they've ended up, of course, in arguments among themselves. And what they have is a sort of a log house that maybe is associated with the Cherokees, but they also lost what was a real landmark on their main street in their town. So we often encourage people to think about integrity, because they did take away a lot of what made it historic. It wasn't just the log section, the beginning of the building, that made it historic. It was also these additions from later in the 19th century. Now, of course, as to be fair to my friends there in that town, because they were trying to do the best thing and trying to make good decisions, they did do something. Here's a property up on the Tennessee-Kentucky border where they didn't do decisions, and everyone was waiting for someone to make a decision. And in the meantime, a big storm came through, dropped some tree limbs onto a roof that was already weakened from water damage because you got holes all over the place here. And you also have trees growing up to the foundation. You've got vines growing everywhere. You know, a lot of things that undermine the strength of the building, and it just started to collapse. And this is now actually a pile of logs and frame and brick elements. It's been lost to time just because people didn't do basic restoration ahead of time as they tried to debate what they wanted to do. So I do know sometimes you have to move on buildings and use your best judgment. But getting as much facts as possible is the first best step. Okay, integrity again. This is a brick building along the Ohio River, and I find it quite interesting in that it's been obviously changed. But I don't know if it had totally lost its history when I was asked to look at this. Because the upper story still has the 9/9 double hung windows. Those bays are intact. And you can see where they matched up down below. That's where the changes had happened. Windows turned from double hung to single pane, doors instead of windows. And then here you have a storefront added where there had been two windows. But you know, you could see that, well, it still sort of spoke to its time period of the 1830s until you started to walk around the building and you found this. Well, now, of course, there's been so many different additions at so many different angles. I always like to use this image too in talking about roofs. I don't know how many different roof angles they have going on this place, but there's a lot. And of course, you could date all of these different additions, but certainly the building has lost its feeling of the 1830s and falls somewhere into the latter decades of the 20th century by the time you consider all of the different changes. So integrity does matter when you're trying to start a restoration project. Yet another example of where people want to tell one story maybe with their building and they find out that, well, you know, history tells us something else. This is a house owned at one time, I was told, by the Cherokee chief, Lewis Ross, the brother of John Ross. Lewis Ross was a very successful merchant working in both Tennessee and Georgia. And, well, he built this house. Well, just from the architectural style that was more Victorian than early, I thought, well, that's probably not true. But maybe this center section here, maybe this was how the house started by Lewis Ross and um, just grew over time. But we found this was a purpose built Victorian house from the 1880s once we did research. And really, the only part of the Lewis Ross story that remained was a section of the foundation. That what had happened was a modern house was put on top of the site of an older house. So we had the sad news to convey that, well, this is a good historic house, and there's certain it's not in poor condition, and we have different recommendations for its preservation, but it's not a Cherokee house, it's not a Lewis Ross house. And you know, just good research by property owners would have told them that to begin with. So, you know, this thing of houses being encased, early houses being encased within later houses, and how do you think about this integrity and what do you want to do? Probably nowhere better than told in another Cherokee house from Georgia, the chieftain's house or the Major Ridge home. And when you look at this house, it was actually the headquarters, excuse me, let me get it right, the superintendent's house for an Italian rayon company that came to Rome, Georgia in the 1920s. They built this to be, the boss's home. It's a very attractive colonial revival home on a big tree lot. Well, it did encase right behind the tree here a room that belonged to Major Ridge. It was a log room that they just built around. We were asked to help earlier in this decade when a proposal came forth that we would tear down all of the existing historic fabric. And you can see here quite a bit had been built to just save that one log room. Well, that hasn't happened. I don't think it will happen because once you pull different groups together and you talked about, okay, you want to use this for interpretive reasons, you want to reflect the wishes of the community, you want to be respectful to the Cherokees, all of those are good things, but maybe you keep the house intact and just talk about how an important place sort of stays important over time and how it might change. So instead of undergoing a major restoration and tearing things away and going back to what they thought it looked like in the past, you can still enjoy the Chieftains Museum as it exists in this image today. So integrity then, however you look at it, is just a key part of what we do. And you've got to think of it in all of these different formats that I've tried to mention briefly here, and then I want to sum up with that the integrity of the overall design, does it really hold together? Does the composition of the elements constitute a form that we can recognize and identify and start to analyze? And then you want to go and use the primary sources plus physical investigation to find out, do we have enough history left in this building to move forth, or should we not really concern ourselves with this? Is this something that we should treat carefully or not? And again, it's not an easy call. A lot of people want to have that integrity of setting, and I'm typically one of those people. But you've got to be cognizant of different values and different ideas and just the scarcity of some building types. This is from an Alabama plantation that over the years the plantation house had been taken away, the plantation fences had been taken away. Let's just say everything had been removed except for this one double cell brick building. And when we were asked to look at it, it was like, well, what do you think we should do? And it was almost like, well, what do you mean? This is a this is just sitting here and it's the only thing left. What story could it tell? Well, this is where you do the historical documentation and you do your research and you find out, oh, it is the only brick slave dwelling left in this part of the state, and one of only a handful that have been identified yet in Alabama. Well, then that puts a different spin on it. That becomes important in itself. And let's do some preservation here. So the property has been sort of mothballed, a good roof on it. Some basic restoration work has taken place. Property's been secured. It's not been really fully interpreted, but that's okay. It is marked by a sign. And I think this is good. Later, the next generation can think about what they want to do with this. I do think we have conserved it for our time. So, all of these integrity questions matter. The materials, have there's been too much removed or too much added? The integrity of workmanship, to me, that's always important. Man, it's those hands of the past, and like that brick slave house, undoubtedly African American slaves made the brick that then made the house. The fact that they had their hands on that speaks volumes to me, and you just don't want to lose that. And that's where, even though everything else about that plantation was gone, and you might think, well, it doesn't have the feeling of a plantation, it's just a little brick home. But in those materials, man, I think a story is told. Okay, so I know we're halfway in, and you must be thinking, okay, let's stop talking about buildings and get to work. But I do like to do that very deliberate process of thinking it through, knowing as much as you can before you start on any conservation project. So now for this last half, let me just hit some recommendations and approaches that we have found in our work at the Center of Historic Preservation that yield success. Okay, we'll start with the three golden rules. And of course, these come out of the Secretary of Interior's rehabilitation standards. You can type Google in Secretary of Interior rehab standards and you'll get every bit of it, and with long explanations. I'll pull out three basic rules. Preserve rather than repair. Of course, regular maintenance is always best, and most people, particularly in our region, make that mistake. Um, if they would just do the regular maintenance, keep things cut away from the building, make sure the drains are working, empty the downspouts, empty the gutters, that helps so much about the water issues, and it saves you money down the road. Repair damaged historic features and elements rather than replacing them with new or modern reproductions. Um, if you can repair it, do so. Um, instead of just introducing new materials because you're not real sure how that might mix together over time. And then, if replacement is really your best option, ensure that the replacement is respectful to what was there before. You want it to fit with that house. You want to be respectful of the craftsmanship of that history that's embedded in the building. But, boy, we work so much on that first rule. Often people don't realize they can use the historic materials. They don't have to take them out. And particularly once they're repaired and maybe strengthened by sistering together another piece of wood or cleaning out the mortar and replacing the mortar. Different steps you can take to keep as much of that historic fabric intact as possible. Now, for log buildings, since you find those throughout the region, and particularly one area that we get asked a lot about now are outbuildings, barns, corn cribs, all of these types of support structures that people find in the rural landscape. So much of those were made of log. So, what do we do with those? Well, here's our basic rules that you want to think about and maybe either adopt or avoid. Foundations are the biggest problem. The pier foundations that might look unstable often have been working for 150 years, so I don't particularly worry about them. The continuous foundations that people want to drop, or in fact, then do a concrete block foundation, it seals up that bottom part of the house and it doesn't allow the building to breathe. Moisture accumulates, as I've said before, you cause problems. I have problems with Portland cement, not when it can be used judiciously, but when it's used totally to replace the chinking or the materials between the logs. It's not a permanent solution. It will trap moisture. It will expand into logs, leading to deterioration. You just want to be very careful with the percentage of Portland cement you use on any type of historic treatment, be it a log treatment or masonry treatment. Another thing people like to do is that, well, this single pin cabin or this dog trot, God, we need more windows. Well, of course, every time you cut into a log, you're going to weaken it. Those logs are meant to be long and then anchored on the corners, not have a lot of openings in them. We see a lot of modern chimney replacement, and I understand that you need to have a chimney that works, that the old stone chimney from 100 years ago might not be the best idea, but sometimes the new chimneys right up against the wall, they don't let, again, the logs to breathe, and you start to see deterioration where the chimney abuts the log construction. And I understand how we love porches in the South. I love sitting on my porch, but I don't live in the log house. So many log houses didn't have porches historically. Keep in mind, a lot of what you see are in additions from the 20th century. And it's not that they're bad, it's just that you have to make sure, do the logs have the ability to catch some sun, to be dry, not to be cold and wet, and again, a place where they're capturing moisture. Just looked at this in a building here in my hometown in the past month. So, here's a house that has a lot of needs. We were brought in maybe a little bit too late because one of the problems of it was, well, the foundation had failed. Dirt had just been allowed to accumulate near the house, and it really wasn't resting on anything. So the bottom logs were rotting out, and as you can see on both ends of the Dogtrot, they have collapsed. So that was just a major problem right there. They would have to be replaced. The whole building needed to be raised. And I don't know if those notching at the corners would be strong enough to really do that effectively. It ended up that did work out, but boy, we had our doubts. Now, this was a dog trot. You can see the sort of frame infill tacked between the two pins at one time. And we love the fact that it had its original stone chimney. And you can see here where the chimney doesn't directly touch the wall. And that allows that section to breathe a little bit more. But you can also see right here at the corner, a window had been cut in that weakened that whole section of the house. And then you got the vines growing into the chimneys, which is not good because that means mortar's being taken away and water's coming in. And of course, we have our usual issues of the big trees right around ready to fall on that roof and probably crush the house. But, that was at the beginning. They want to do the job right. They wanted a lot of good advice. We tried to give that to them. They got hooked up with a good contractor. I haven't had a chance to go back to that project, but I look forward to it. That's been a project of the last couple of years. This is an example of when you sort of not muck it up, but maybe too many changes. The Portland cement, instead of some type of more breathable natural material, you use Portland cement. And of course, natural materials, traditional chinking with mud and horsehair and a little bit of rock and moss and whatever might bind something together and seal up the house. Yeah, you would have to replace that periodically. But this is pure Portland cement, not mitigated at all, and it's just pressing against the logs. There's your fine chimney. It's a beautiful piece of work, but of course it's pressing right up against the wall, and that's leading to deterioration. You got your porches that keep half of the front of the house sort of wet year round because there's no sun coming in. And, you know, it is a historic site in Georgia. It's a very interesting building, but we are concerned about long-term sustainability of the property. Okay, so other common issues that you can find. Um, Notch logs that extend beyond the roof line or the roof line is deteriorated. Well, once those start to get wet, they start to deteriorate, and then that can undermine the entire building. I've already talked about foliage and flower beds and all of that. And then the foundation too close to the stone. The additions that trap water against the logs. These are points I've already talked about, and now you can see where the problems come up. This is a good example of the notching being exposed to too much water and it's just deteriorating, particularly here in the lower section, and the building is going to collapse. Here on the right is a good example of the big overhanging porch, a little bit too much porch, but actually this museum wanted to have the space to be able to do exhibits for students outside, which makes total sense. But it also means this part of the log structure hardly ever gets any sunlight whatsoever. Other parts of the house are getting full sunlight throughout the year. That means that it's just uneven in its treatment. That's not good for long-term stabilization. And then here's a good example of a dwelling where, yeah, you had the porch attached to the house, and that was finally removed. I think it probably just collapsed away. But then look at all the damage right there on the bottom logs because that porch trapped moisture at that where the two connected. And the place is just not a wreck, but obviously the conservation issues are pretty profound. And here's a good example, not keeping your foundation secured. It started to slip a little bit. Well, if the house falls off of this, you've got a real problem. So stone pier foundations aren't always perfect, and you do have to maintain those as well. So these are common issues that we see, and here's an example I wanted to throw in on the vibration issue. This was a museum that wanted to take their early building and preserve it, and they decided to put it right by the railroad track because they could get that tract of land. Well, that's well and good, but of course the problem is you've got freight trains moving by, and this gets a lot more vibration than it would ever have gotten in this historic setting. So the stone foundations, everything about this is pretty good. Even the modern brick chimney has been pulled back some from the house, which is also good. But the problem that they were encountering with the foundation shifting, and it's like this building's getting sort of wampered. Well, it is because you've got too much vibration that it's experiencing. And you would think all of that is obvious and commonplace, but this is the project of the last 10 years. So even though we've learned so much in conservation, it is interesting how quickly we can backslide. Okay, a few words about repairing damaged logs. You know, again, preserve is the best step. Repair is better than replacement. And that's where I sort of fall in with this building here. It's a building that had some issues to begin with because of the heavy use of Portland cement as permanent chinking. Well, moisture had gathered. It didn't. They also had the porch, and they weren't getting sort of equitable and consistent sunlight. So you had little problems in the logs that they thought they would solve by just adding more Portland cement. Well, the nature of Portland cement meant that's not really a solution. So we've seen this so often, we have come up with some general rules. And what we like is for to encourage people to use wood epoxy or something similar to that. You can do this yourself. You don't need a contractor to do this. You can get one. They'll be glad to do it for you. But you can do this yourself. You can get this online or from your neighborhood hardware store. You add a bit of sawdust to it or maybe some brown pigment. It'll even look better with the look of the log. Um, it can look more like chinking, and it can repair the log. Now it does change it. It's instead of being just all wood, it's sort of like wood and plastic now. But it will help you keep that original log in place and maybe last another generation. Now you can do the job right from the start, which is what the National Park Service did at Shiloh Battlefield, which is on the Tennessee-Mississippi border, just a few miles north of Mississippi. And this house has been on the battlefield since the battle. And when the federal government acquired the battlefield in the 1890s, they didn't remove it. They let it stay there. Now, certainly the National Park Service has done some repair work up in the gable ends. It's got a recent roof on it. That's maybe 20, 30 years old. They keep a shingle roof on it. But notice how they use the chinking that comes from that time period. That's not Portland cement. Those logs are in good shape. The roof overhang is such that the notching hasn't deteriorated. It's up on a stone pier foundation, and that's in fairly good shape. The one thing that the Park Service has done in the last 10 years, they used to just leave the door open so people could sort of experience the space. But the weight of people on the foundation, they decided might be a bit much since they couldn't control how many people might go in there at once. So they have locked that door to help its future conservation. Okay, now in my last 20 minutes here, let me switch over to masonry buildings and some general rules on that. And my basic theme is going to be the inappropriate cleaning of masonry and also the problems of water. But really, water gets to be a problem if you clean masonry inappropriately and then you take away that original surface and water gets inserted into the material. So this question comes up so often. We need to clean our building. It's an old building. It looks pretty ratty. What do we do? Well, here's an 1850s brick building where, yeah, they needed to do that some time ago. Water damage had led to a lot of deterioration of bricks. And in fact, in that little dark section right there, I could push my finger through some of those bricks. They had so returned back to their natural state. So they did need to do that. But we encourage them, don't just decide on a treatment and do it. First, test. Take a small patch somewhere and see if that works. And then what you don't want to do is use real harsh chemicals. We emphasize that you use hand labor. I do get kitted by sites and contractors. Well, we just don't have all the students that you do to do that. But you do have a budget, and you can use low pressure water and what I call light soapy water. Apply by hand to clean what you can. And yeah, it's not going to look pristine anymore, but you do protect that historic surface that keeps the long term issue of water at bay. Don't sandblast. I know that seems crazy to say nowadays, but still, I ran into this as a possible treatment on a building just 3 years ago. Well, we're going to sandblast that paint color off the brick and go back to the original color. Well, okay, you can do that if you want to destroy the building. And they were like, oh, no, 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 we don't want to do that. They talked to their contractor. He came back and said, well, we'll use, water powered uh, blasting. We'll just wet blast it. And that's okay. But even that will usually include little bits of, sand, rock, or something to quote clean it, and you're hitting it with an extremely powerful jet of water. That's going to potentially take off that top layer too. So what I say here in the bottom PowerPoint, bullet point, abrasive cleaning is never appropriate, whether it's sand blasting, bead blasting, wheel blasting, or brittle blasting, because contractors will say that maybe is what they want to do with a more modern building, and it's not historic, and they're not thinking of long-term sustainability. But that's not what we're dealing with. We're always thinking of sustainability. So you just don't want to use any type of abrasive cleaning. I can't even endorse high pressure water cleaning. Um, because again, not so much that it might damage the surface, it loosens mortar. And then, of course, mortar has cracks or parts of it pulled out. Well, that becomes another way water gets introduced. And whatever you do, even if you're using your light soapy water with a diligent young person, don't do it when it's freezing, because water will stay on the surface. It will freeze and expand, and then your deterioration starts. So you want to be very careful in cleaning, but you can clean masonry. Now, repointing it, yeah, sometimes you have to do that. Here's a case of a brick home where they let vines grow throughout the house. They had a water issue here coming from an air conditioning unit, and the mortar had failed, and the wall was starting to buckle out. Can't quite see that from this angle. You can see maybe a bit of it here. But yeah, it was an issue, and the mortar needed to be replaced. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we first recommend that you use a hand rake with natural bristles, not something metal that might damage the brick. You hand rake out those mortar joints to remove the damaged mortar. And then you try to make sure you recreate as close as possible. Not the look of it is desirable, but it's the strength that's important. That the mortar should be softer than the brick or stone, because if it's harder, it will expand and it can damage or crack the brick and stone. You just don't want those cracks in the brick, as the bullet point emphasizes. Let the mortar breathe a little bit. It's meant to do that. And then only repoint those areas that require it. You don't have to address a whole wall. A lot of people think that's what they have to do, and it's too expensive. Solve the problem. If the rest of it is working, that means it's not a problem. So we have these rules of when you're repointing with mortar. Never use mortar with a high percentage of Portland cement. We tend to think that it can be used in the line composition of mortar to make that material easier to work, but probably no more than 20%. And what we tend to see on both brick buildings and log buildings, and wherever mortar is being used in Portland cement, it's 100%. And that's not what you want to do. You don't want to use synthetic caulking, because it's plastic. It again seals the joint true, but these things are meant to breathe somewhat. It's not good. And you typically don't want to make the mortar wider. You don't want to change the width, or what we call the profile, when you're applying new mortar. Try to be respectful again to that original workmanship that you have that you're trying to preserve. Um, and we don't like shortcuts. I'm sorry, we're difficult. Don't use scrub coating. Where okay, let's just take the mortar and sort of brush it over the whole surface and then scrub that away from the brick, and then the mortar remains, and that means it's perfectly sealed and it just looks wonderful. No, again, don't add the mortar to the brick. That can again deteriorate the brick. And of course, you don't do this work when it's freezing or when it's too hot, which sometimes is difficult. I do have contractors. Okay, Doc, we can't do this when it's 30 degrees, but you don't want us to do it when it's 90 degrees. How do we ever get this done around here in the South? Well, I admit this is something I can be somewhat flexible on because contractors have demands. It's hard to get to contractors. You have to get the work done when you can. But you can do the job right. This is from the Mississippi Delta, the famous Riverside Hotel. As you can see, it's on the Blues Trail, and they redid their walls well, repointed it. This place is in pretty good condition, and now it's a real recognized, sort of historic site and landmark. Okay, but whatever you're doing, always keep in mind the issues of water. I use this image of a slave dwelling that has been nicely restored. He said, well, we like the ivy growing on it. Well, that's never good. That is pulling away the top surface of the brick and the stone and allowing water to come in. And it's just keeping that sort of sealed up too. So when it does rain, all that water stays on that surface for longer than it would normally. And this is what happens when you don't keep your mortar in good shape and your water is a problem because you've got so much foliage around trapping moisture. Brick starts to fall apart, as you can see right there. And suddenly you can take a foundation that in this case was 100 and I think 40 years old and was actually well built. It starts to fall apart. And it's really your choice. That was something that did not have to happen. And the same here with, again, as you can see, they had addressed it under our suggestion with a drainage pipe with a French drain that then is taking that water as the piping goes a little bit farther away here from this angle, taking it away from the building altogether. But they've got a bunch of cleaning and stuff to do, but they have and repointing bricks, as you can see some of the gaps here, but they have addressed that big issue first. So, in my last words, I have to get my shots in at the waterproofing industry. I have nothing against it for cedar decks on your back of your house. But I don't think we want to use it on historic masonry. Because some people think, well, we'll seal it up and that solves the water issues. Water can't get in. Well, some of that material, some of those commercially available coatings will change the original appearance of your brick because the chemical composition of the sealant is not particularly stable. That can, it doesn't look good. And also, again, by sort of sealing it up, that can actually accelerate deterioration. And this is where we also don't recommend adding stucco or cement to patch a brick. It's better to replace the brick in this sense. I hate to go against my own rules, but it's better to replace than try to patch because those materials are just different. And to get them to blend together appropriately might be near impossible. And this is what happens when you don't do these things and why it really matters. This is in Money, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. It's the store where Emmett Till allegedly insulted the white woman that led to his murder. And of course, the Emmett Till case changed the whole nation as the precursor to the civil rights movement. Well, undoubtedly a very important building. Undoubtedly, a lot of poor choices have been made, and this building is not lost, but it's getting there. From such issues as just a tree growing next to it, to awnings that were inappropriate, to different treatment of bricks, to a roof not being there. We don't want to lose these types of buildings, and they don't have to be lost because they tell important stories and stories of where the South helped to shape the nation. So that's what I have for you guys today. Some just a quick overview and then thinking about conservation of key places in the South and what is historic. And I'm glad to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. That was really thorough. I learned so much from that. I hope all of our attendees did too. But yeah, we do have a couple minutes, about 9 minutes or so for questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and write them down there in the chat box where we were saying where we were from earlier. I don't see anybody typing. So you were just so thorough, Dr. West, that we don't have any questions, it looks like, over here.
Well, it's Good Friday, and everyone's looking forward to the weekend
Yes.
too. So I understand all of that.
Well, thank you so much again. We really appreciate it. If anybody does have any questions and they want to send them to me, I can forward them on. And I'm sure Dr. West would be happy to get back to you.
Oh yes, no problem whatsoever. Just give me a good excuse to go down into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much again, and we'll be putting a recording of this one on our website later, so if you have any colleagues that missed this, you can point them towards the recording of it. So thank you very much again, and have a great Easter weekend.